What is up, and welcome to AMSCO APU World History, Chapter 18, all about Russia. Please make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share these videos with your friends. Thanks so much for your support. Russians were the people that would eventually become known as the Eastern Europeans, and for most of their development during this time period, they were Eastern Orthodox. They got their religion primarily from the Byzantine Empire, which was actually just south of them. So there were, of course, lots of priests and other religious leaders who traveled back and forth and spread their religion since it was in such close proximity. But the first people to really take this and take strong hold of this religion were the rulers of Kievan Rus. So Kiev is located right here in modern-day Ukraine, and basically they came right before the Russians as we know it today. They modeled their government and religion after Constantinople, so they tried to make their government strong, unlike many of the other areas around them at the time, such as decentralized Western Europe. And they also operated by the rule of divine right. Basically, they were chosen by God to rule this area of land. Also at this time, there were lots of influences by outside forces, such as the Mongols. The Mongols in Russia, of course, were called the Golden Horde. They ruled from 1251 to 480, and as you can see, they were sort of like the most western of all the Mongol empires, stretching out from Mongolia and China, as seen here. The Golden Horde was characterized by loose rule, and they were primarily decentralized. All they really wanted was to have tributary states. Basically, they would just collect money, taxes, resources, anything to help themselves out, but they were really having an hands-off approach on controlling the Russian people. Also, trade was a huge factor in Russia at this time. They primarily traded timber, so that's a big thing to know. And this timber trade really helped them because wood was needed during this time in building ships and other places around the world, and Russia had a lot of it because they had a lot of forests, even still true today. They also were a big vehicle for trade for silk and textiles, so textiles came from like England out west, and silk of course came from the east in China, so they were kind of like an alternate route from the Mesopotamian civilizations that sort of operated around this area too. They were easier to travel through, of course, because they didn't have super strong empires that would make them pay taxes or tribute if they wanted to pass through and trade. So the time period we're really talking about here starts from 1000 AD to around 1900. And during this span of around 900 years, there were many Russian rulers. Some of the most famous include Peter I, also known as Peter the Great. He was the Prince of Moscow, so Moscow is also the modern capital of Russia. And he was most known for kicking out the Mongols because, of course, the Russians didn't like to pay tribute anymore, so he thankfully kicked out the Mongols for the Russians. He also established major trade locations all around Russia, and he really helped to grow the timber and fur trade at this time to really expand Russia into sort of like an economic hub as well. Of course, Russia had lots of forests, so timber was big, and also the fur trade, such as beaver skins and other animal pelts across Western Europe were really popular during his time. Most notably, though, he was known for his Western reforms, so these included dress, refining the dress of Russians to look more like the Western Europeans, and also education. So he really sponsored educating the young people of Russia and trying to make Russia more knowledgeable, just like the rest of Western Europe during the Renaissance of the time. He was also known for breaking up the land into provinces, so it was sort of easier for his government to control. Following him was like Ivan the Terrible, and he was this murderer, so that's probably why he was called Ivan the Terrible. But he basically murdered his son, and in many villages he massacred whole villages just because sometimes these villages didn't listen to him or he didn't get his way. Many people thought he was actually like a maniac, and by this account of him, he looks kind of crazy too. But one great thing he did do was create St. Basil's Cathedral, which is this modern-day Orthodox cathedral in Red Square in Moscow, seen right here. It's really one of the defining points of Byzantine and even world architecture with the onion domes. So at least that's one good thing added to Russian culture. There was also Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, and she was known because, of course, she was one of the few women rulers in world history. She was able to rule Russia, and she primarily established places such as girls' schools. So it really scaled back the patriarchy of the time and helped women grow a little bit, although women were still sort of in an inferior position at the time. She also helped to pull Russia through a series of wars. Many wars happened to Russia at this time because they were expanding big and they had resources that other people wanted. Finally, we'll end with the Romanovs. So Romanovs are probably the ones people are most familiar with. They were sort of near 1900 the primarily ruling family for Russia. They included like Tsar Alexander and also the famous Rasputin, who was an advisor to this family. But basically, there was a whole bunch of conspiracy, and eventually the whole family got murdered, and the Russian Revolution eventually overthrew them and established sort of modern-day Russia. But that's a story for later. Socially, Russia was really known for its serfdom. So serfdom's definition is basically that it's the status of many peasants under feudalism, and specifically manorialism. So basically at this time in Eastern Europe and also Western Europe, these landlords, the feudal lords, would hold large amounts of land, and they would conscript people to work these lands. And a lot of people were serfs, and they became part of this serfdom hierarchy. It was basically a condition of debt bondage, so it's kind of like they were in servitude. It wasn't totally slavery, but it was pretty close to slavery. And it developed primarily during the High Middle Ages, so around this time, and lasted until the mid-19th century, until eventually Tsar Alexander II freed all the serfs in Russia. That was primarily the social structure of early Russia. And basically, if you own land or were a merchant, you were kind of better off than all the other peasant farmers. So up until the time of Catherine the Great, this was primarily the social structure, but during the time of Catherine the Great, some of these peasants started revolting and even got some freedoms, although not complete freedoms. And during this time, serfs also initiated and were struggling with some wars that were going on at the time. Some were the Crimean Wars, which occurred primarily around the Black Sea. The Black Sea, of course, is the area that separates Russia from Byzantine, so seen right here. Also, this famous war was versus the Ottomans, who by this time had taken over the Byzantine Empire and converted the whole empire to Islam. And the Ottomans were aided by the British and French, which is kind of crazy because the British and French both were Christianity nations. But ultimately, these three countries and others went against Russia because by this time, Russia was expanding so much and people really just wanted to control Russia, or they would have taken over practically the whole world. And that's basically why they wanted to control Russian expansion. Ultimately, as said before, Tsar Alexander II of the Romanovs freed the serfs, and soon after came the Russian Revolution, which of course sort of put Russia into this era of communism that is so famous with them today. So this has been Chapter 18, AMSCO AP World History, all about Russian expansion. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.